Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with my good friend David Pallmann, my favorite Dillard's employee, as you can see, and we are here to discuss Matthean and Markan Priority. So, this is a very exciting topic. David's been doing a lot of research into it, and I'm excited to see what he's discovered so far. So, David, how are you?
Doing great, man, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is awesome. This topic is so fascinating, especially with New Testament studies and also people who are interested in, what do the early church fathers say? What do we know about the Gospels and their composition? So this is going to be a really exciting topic. What got you into it, if I can just ask there?
Yeah, it kind of began for me. My interest in New Testament sort of so it's a little background is I was raised in sort of a very fundamentalist Baptist denomination. I know you know something about that, but yeah, being raised there, we weren't really like we were just sort of taught to stay away from scholarship and things
Mm.
like that. So biblical studies and stuff was not something I had a lot of exposure to in my early life. We just believed the Bible because it was the Word of God. As I got a little bit older and began questioning why do I actually believe Christianity, why do I believe the Bible, things like that, then I developed an interest in Christian apologetics. And so my introduction to biblical studies was very much from a Christian apologetics perspective. And so, of course, it's studying apologetics. I would study arguments and reasons to believe in the historical reliability of the New Testament. And to me, the question of the authorship of the Gospels was always kind of an important issue because I always like to know, where I'm getting my information from. And so the first sources or pieces of evidence that I was introduced to for believing in the traditional authorship of the Gospels was, of course, our patristic witnesses. And so I would just get like a bunch of quotations of people like, see, here's evidence that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But as I was reading these quotations, they were all emphatic that the Gospel of Matthew is the first gospel to have been written. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later when I got into college, took a course on the New Testament, and I was introduced to this idea that the overwhelming majority of scholars just believe that Mark is the first gospel to be written. And so I kind of had this tension then in my mind of, I'm being taught that Mark is the first gospel to be written, but my earliest sources say that Matthew was written first. So I kind of bracketed that discussion, put it to the side, just to continue with my studies. But eventually, I always kind of wanted to return to it. And so, it came up that, okay, this whole reason is based on allegedly the arguments for Markan Priority are just so overwhelming that we have to, as Mark Goodacre says, we have to take the patristic testimony with a grain of salt. And so I really want to see, okay, well, how firm is the foundation, right? Because I think we've got good reasons for believing that the patristic testimony is, generally speaking, reliable, right? Not necessarily infallible, but reliable. So if I'm gonna, say that they're wrong on something like that, I want good reasons for that. So that's just kind of what led me into the synoptic problem. I had to see how strong are the arguments for the priority of Mark, and so yeah, sorry for that. That's a long-winded way of telling you how I got into the study.
No, this is good. So let's start then with the synoptic problem itself. And, um, some people might say, well, is it a problem or just a question? So just, being careful about our words here because, I mean, maybe you can call it the synoptic mystery, right? But can you talk to us about what this technical phrase synoptic problem means?
For sure, yeah. It gets tossed around a lot, and it's second nature to me at this point. So much so that actually, in kind of one of the theology groups I'm in, I posted a poll saying kind of like, "What's everyone's perspective on the synoptic problem?" All the responses were instantly like, "There's no problems with the Bible." And I was like, no, that's not what it means. But yeah, so it can be a bit of a misleading term, right? Because it's not like we're saying that there's a problem in the sense that there's something wrong. It might be better called the synoptic puzzle, for example. But I mean, basically, what this is we've got four gospels in the Bible, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the synoptic gospels are the first three, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they've got a lot of similarities between them in terms of that they're covering a lot of the same stories, the same events. And John has just a lot of unique stories that we don't find in the other gospels. And it's not just that these three gospels are giving us the same stories, it's that they're giving them to us in the same words. And so we got this, phenomenon here of what's called, significant verbatim agreement between the gospels. And this is significant, especially because, in Greek, the arrangements of letters, right, it's not as significant as it would be for something like English. Letters don't have to be arranged as specifically, and yet we find, the exact same words frequently in the same order in many places in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you've got the triple tradition, which is where Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have something together, and then separate issue, you got the double tradition, right, which is just what Luke and Matthew share together and doesn't have a parallel in Mark. And so what this has led most scholars to think is that you've got some level of literary dependence going on among these three synoptic gospels, that to some extent or another, some of the later gospels that were written knew one or both of the earlier gospels that were written. And so then the question that, the synoptic problem wants to answer is sort of who's writing first, and, who's writing second, and who's writing third, and then, to what extent are they using the other gospels. There are some people who would disagree with that, like for example, this book here by T.M. Derrico, right, tries to argue that literary, or rather oral tradition, accounts for a lot of that similarity. But I mean, there are like real problems with that. There's like one example where there's like this aside in I think it's in Matthew and Mark. I'd have to look up the exact reference, but basically oral tradition can't explain this like one verbatim agreement, because like right in the middle of Jesus's words, the author inserts like this aside, like let the reader know, or like, and so it's clearly there's a written source here. So it seems like there's some literary dependence going on. So the synoptic problem, in short, is just trying to figure out the chronology of the Gospels, we could say.
All right. So some people are going to say, especially the patristics, that Matthew is the first, and then, the others depend on him in some way, Mark and Luke. Whereas contemporary scholarship is going to say, no, Matthew and Luke, or maybe just Matthew or just Luke, depending on who you ask. But anyway, Mark is the one that has the priority. He's the first one. And then the other gospels, or one of the other gospels, depends on Mark's as the source for their dependence. And so let's talk about then, why did Markan Priority become so popular? What are well, maybe we don't have to talk about the arguments just yet, but just talk to me about the history of how did we get to Markan Priority?
Sure, yeah. So as you said, like the patristics kind of set the tone, right? They are the first ones to talk about this, as far as we can tell, and they're all, clear that they believe that the Gospel of Matthew is written first. We just, have it in all of our Bibles, right? They're ordered Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So this was just kind of the assumed order of the Gospels, right up until around, the time of the Enlightenment, when you had things like higher criticism come along. That's a little bit later than the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment is what gives rise to it. So the Bible was, no longer considered as untouchable and sacred as perhaps it might have been at one time. And so people started looking at it a lot more critically. And so that's when, they were noticing these sorts of phenomena, which isn't to say they hadn't been noticed prior to that. Obviously, the early Christian diatessaron clearly, acknowledges verbal agreements and stuff between the synoptics. But the point being is that people started looking at these a lot more critically, and were willing to maybe ask questions that weren't smiled upon at earlier points in history prior to that. And so Matthean priority was still the dominant hypothesis. And actually, for a while, the Griesbach hypothesis, the idea that Matthew and Luke are the first two written and Mark is the third one, that was actually the dominant hypothesis, probably 200 to 250 years ago. But all that changed. There were several arguments that came along from people like Strauss and G.M. Styler and B.H. Streeter. They put all these arguments forward for why people should think that Mark was first, and these arguments proved really persuasive to people. And so yeah, it's probably for the past 100 years or so, even a little beyond, Markan priority has become the big dominant theory. Even among people who are maybe skeptical of the two source theory, which for people who aren't familiar with that, that says that Mark and this other non-extant document called Q are the two primary sources that Matthew and Luke both, independently pull from. That's the dominant theory, but even people who maybe hold to something like the Farrer hypothesis instead have still largely been persuaded that Mark is the first gospel to have been written. Now, the Griesbach hypothesis has had a bit of a revival in like the last half of the 20th century. So it kind of began with B.C. Butler publishing a book called The Originality of St. Matthew in 1951. He kicked things off in England, so that's kind of where the Griesbach hypothesis started having its revival. H.H. Stolt did something similar in Germany shortly thereafter. And then the biggest return was in the United States with the work of William Farmer and his students. They sort of revived this hypothesis and began challenging Markan priority again. So while, I'm not saying this has become the dominant hypothesis or anything, certainly Markan priority is still the big one, but it's come under significant fire, in the past 50 to 70 years.
Yeah, because from what I can tell, I was listening to Bart Ehrman's podcast the other day, misquoting Jesus, and I enjoy it for like an intellectual workout to keep me sharp on what critical scholars are saying. And I think he admitted somewhere that it wasn't until the 19th century, the 1800s, that Matthean priority was finally overturned and Markan priority became, let's say, orthodoxy among academics. Which is to say that I think he acknowledged, or it was the host, Megan Lewis, who acknowledged that, it was probably Bart who said this, that for 1800 years, basically, the consensus was Matthean priority until the 19th century. So that's pretty significant to have that kind of switch in paradigms, right, in that time period. So um, let's see. So we got into why or how Markan priority became popular, right? Let's now look at some of the arguments for why this is the case. And I just want to emphasize too, really quick, for anybody who's listening, in New Testament scholarship today, like Markan priority is just largely assumed and just taken as, I don't want to say dogma, but just like, academic orthodoxy, right? Everybody knows Mark came first, right? And to question that, I think that's a monumental task. And so let's first begin then with just what happened with the arguments for Markan priority. What are they, and what critiques do you have of them from your research, David?
Sure, yeah. So one, really historically prominent argument was arguments from order. So these sorts of arguments are based on the fact that Mark's order of pericopes and events is generally also found in Matthew and Luke. And when either Matthew or Luke has an order which differs from Mark, then the other gospel will follow Mark's order. So, Matthew and Luke very rarely agree together against Mark in their pericope order. So from that sort of phenomenon, particularly B.H. Streeter was a big proponent of this argument. Streeter inferred that Matthew and Luke must have used Mark, since they very rarely agree in order against him. And that argument was like really persuasive to scholars for a while. It was really instrumental in turning the tide against Markan priority. The issue with this argument is that all it does is establish that Mark is the middle term between Matthew and Luke. It just establishes that there's some kind of dependency relation there, but it's incapable of determining the direction that the dependency goes. So it tells you either Matthew and Luke depend on Mark, or Mark depends on Matthew and Luke. So Streeter was sort of reading his perspective into the data there. And so seeing that Mark is the middle term, then assumed that it had to be Matthew and Luke who were depending on Mark, when in reality, it could just as easily be read the other way. And instead you can see Mark as, pulling Luke and Matthew together. So this argument, it still comes up from time to time, but probably not so much among synoptic experts ever since, again, this book here by B.C. Butler, The Originality of St. Matthew. He spends a whole chapter on that argument. And to the point, his critique of it is so complete that to this day, synoptic experts who are Markan priorists will acknowledge that, yeah, arguments from order, they just don't work. So there's also arguments from Semitisms that allegedly Luke, or rather Mark, has more Semitisms, or which are sort of like distinctively Jewish words. There'll be more of those in Mark than in the other Gospels. Problem there is it's questionable that Semitisms really do indicate temporal priority.
Right.
There's no real reason to think that. And it's also just questionable that Mark really does have the most Semitisms. For example, in this book here, Ward Powers does a like analysis of how many Semitisms are in each synoptic, and he comes up with that Matthew has the most, Luke has the second most, and Mark has the least. So even if we accepted that assumption, he just argues empirically, you don't have any grounds for concluding that Mark does have the most Semitisms. So that even if we accepted the assumption that Semitisms indicate temporal priority, it's not going to be favorable towards Markan priority. Popular argument comes from like the Christology of Mark. They say Mark allegedly has a lower Christology than Matthew and Luke. And so there's so what they'll say is that, so we see like Matthew and Luke increasing Luke's Christology as this idea of Jesus as God evolves over time. And so look, we can see that Mark has to be first because he has the lowest Christology of all the synoptics. Several problems with this argument. In the first place, it assumes that the idea that Jesus was God evolved over time and isn't present from the inception of Christianity. But I mean, I think we know that's false just from surveying Paul's own writings. I think it's very clear in Paul's writings that Paul has a very high Christology where he fully understands Jesus as God. Like Richard Bauckham says, the earliest Christology was already the highest Christology. So we don't have evidence for this idea that high Christology was this sort of later invention. And without that, this argument can't really get off the ground because all of our lower Christology that comes from people like the Gnostics and such, that all comes later in history. So if anything, our best evidence indicates that lower Christology came later, not earlier. But in the second place, I would just want to dispute that Luke does have a low Christology. The examples that they give, a favorite one that they give is like Mark 6, 5-6, right? Where it says that Jesus could not do any miracles in his hometown of Nazareth. Whereas if we read the parallel in like Matthew 13, then it says that Jesus did not do many miracles.
Right.
And so the argument is, well, look, Matthew's changed Mark here. He's changing him to get rid of this embarrassing detail that Jesus was like unable to do this miracle. And I just find that so problematic because it's very implausible to me that the author of Mark's gospel really believed that like the unbelief of the people in Nazareth somehow took away Jesus's ability to do miracles. And I think just a careful reading of the Gospel of Mark is going to show us that that's not the case, right? I mean, like the story of the healing of the paralytic in Mark 2. Very clear in this passage that Jesus is God, right? He heals the paralytic man to prove that he is the Son of God who has, the authority on earth to forgive sins. And he's being accused of blasphemy in this context. So he's proving his own deity in this passage by doing a miracle. And an interesting thing in that passage is he heals the paralytic, the text says, when he sees the man's faith. So what we see in Mark's gospel is this idea that Jesus is responsive to faith. He chooses to heal people in response to their faith. But then we also have this very clear understanding that this is his ability to forgive sins and to heal people is evidence of his deity. So we get a very high Christology in Mark in this passage. And in addition to that, we see, I think we have an explanation for what Mark means when he says that Jesus could not heal many people in Nazareth because of their unbelief. Mark isn't saying that people's belief or lack thereof is somehow how Jesus has the power to heal people. It's just meant to be understood as Jesus has chosen to be responsive to faith. It wasn't present in many people in Nazareth. That's why he couldn't heal many people there, was because they weren't fulfilling that condition, in other words. So there are other examples they can give, and I would give similar arguments to that. I don't think Mark does have a low Christology. But again, even if he did, there's just no reason to think that high Christology is a later invention.
Right. I mean, even people like Dale Allison will say that, and I say even people, people who are generally seen as like very critical scholars, dyed in the wool of New Testament scholarship, like Dale Allison, they'll acknowledge that high Christology, or at least the idea of pre-existence, that Christ had, previously existed before the incarnation or his conception, human conception, that idea was already present in Paul's writings. And so the idea that, you would have this evolution in the Gospels when already the earliest Christian strata and literature that we have is high Christology, that seems just not to fit the picture of what we have. So, I mean, that's, I think, a strong point in favor of what you were saying. Another argument I've heard for like Markan priority is that, well, Mark's shorter and Mark leaves out a lot of things. And who in the world would do that? Things like, I don't know what your take is on the original ending of Mark. I don't know. I don't know if you're a rebel against the consensus there too, that the original ending was just the women running away in terror, or if you actually believe that there's the longer ending belongs. But where was I going with that question?
How do I explain the shortness as well as Mark's particular omissions?
Sure. Yeah. There we go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's another point to this argument as well, as how do we sort of explain Mark's additions, right? Mark has these particular points in him, his unique material, right, which is frequently judged to be kind of weird stuff, right? Like the naked man running away in the Garden of Gethsemane, or Jesus healing a person with saliva or things like that. These are judged to be sorts of things that Matthew and Luke would have had motivation to leave out, and so Goodacre calls this the argument from additions and omissions. But I think the same answer to that is the same answer to the issue of why Mark is shorter than the other synoptics. And so I think it comes down to the genre or the purposes of Mark's writing here. So there's an assumption here that Mark is intended to be a gospel of the same sort as Matthew and Luke. And if that's the case, then assuming the short ending of Mark, for the sake of argument, then it's surprising that he leaves out the resurrection appearances, right? Surprising that he leaves out the nativity story, right? The birth of Jesus. Surprising that those sorts of things are left out. One thing I think that should tip us off, though, that Mark is not intended, doesn't have the same purposes as Matthew and Luke, is that he tips his hand that he has knowledge of the resurrection appearances, right? Because even with the short ending of Mark, there's this prediction from the angel that there will be this appearances from Jesus. So Mark knows about this. And the author of Mark, by all accounts, is a Christian. And we know that the earliest Christians believed in the resurrection appearances of Jesus. So whether you think Mark is first or last, there's this question of why doesn't he include these stories, right? And so my answer to that is he's not trying to give us a full story of Jesus. He's not trying to give us all of the details. So Matthew and Luke are both going to be what's called didache, which is it's early Christian teaching for people who are believers. I agree with Ward Powers that Mark is best understood as early Christian kerygma, and kerygma it's different than didache because this isn't intended for people who are part of the faith community. This is intended to be proclaimed and preached to people who are outside of the faith community. So the details of Jesus's birth, or what he said to his disciples after his resurrection and stuff, this is of interest to people who are inside of the Christian faith. This is not the sort of thing that is going to be as interesting to people who are outside of the faith. So this is why I think Mark has omitted these particular details, is because they're just not going to be of interest to his intended audience. So instead, he's just taking the charismatic parts of Matthew and Luke and basically putting them together in his own narrative, as well as with some anecdotes that he remembers from the Apostle Peter, because we've got some strong church tradition that Peter was also influential in Mark's writing of this gospel. So that's how I explain the uniquely Markan material, is that these are sort of anecdotes that he adds in based on his own memories of what Peter taught about Jesus. So if we take that model, I think that actually explains rather well why Mark is shorter. And he's trying to be less detailed for an audience that's not going to care about some of these details, leaving out stories that won't be relevant to them, and then supplementing some of Peter's own eyewitness memories in here from for his audience.
Yeah.
The other point I was going to raise on that is I think this also explains why Mark has quote unquote bad grammar, is because this is something that's intended to be orally preached to people. So he colloquializes it. It's not written as formally as Matthew and Luke, because those gospels were intended to be read. This one's intended to be preached. So I think Power's theory there makes a lot of sense of Mark's additions, his omissions, why he's shorter, and why he's got poor grammar.
Yeah, speaking about the I guess the charismatic intention of Mark, somebody might say, well, even a non-Christian audience, surely they'd be interested in what the resurrection appearances were like, right? I mean, in some ways, one might read Mark, and let's say you assume the shorter ending, it kind of leaves you on a cliffhanger, right? Maybe that's intentional, but wouldn't we want to know other details, like where did this man come from? What's his birth like? What's his lineage? These sorts of things. Somebody could maybe give pushback there. What are your thoughts?
I think they could. And so a few points. I think Mark's gospel here is deliberately shorter because writing back then is expensive. It's an expensive endeavor. So Mark is kind of trying to trim the fat, as it were. It's not to say that unbelievers would have no interest in these sorts of things. It's just that they would be primarily or of much more interest to believers. So I'm not saying that like unbelievers would have been completely uninterested in these things. It's just to say that I think the nativity story, for example, is a clear question or a clear example of something that's going to be of much more interest to people who are followers of Jesus. And honestly, we can even see that today, that, in the celebration of Christmas, that, the nativity story tends to be a much bigger part for believers than for unbelievers. So I think even contemporaneously, we can see that some of these things are of more interest to believers than unbelievers. But as it regards to the resurrection stories or the resurrection appearances, notice that that's still going to remain that issue if you don't buy the charismatic theory there. The question is still going to remain on the hypothesis of Markan priority. We know Mark knows about these appearances because he predicts them, and for whatever reason, assuming the short ending of Mark, he doesn't choose to give the details. At best, then we just don't know why that is. But that mystery there will remain even on the hypothesis of Markan priority. So I don't think it can be used to argue for it.
Well, I know, for example, and people are going to roll their eyes when I say this, but I think it's in the Gospel of Thomas, right? It's written in such a way where it's intended to make the person who's reading it want to consult someone in that community. So that, for example, what is it? The Gospel of Thomas says, like, if you interpret this book properly, then you'll have eternal life, right? Or you'll never die. And it's written in a cryptic way such that you will want to actually take that text and go to a community. This is what scholars are saying. Take the text, into the community and learn, okay, how do I interpret this book, right? And I think similarly with Mark's gospel, the ending, if it just leaves on the high note or the cliffhanger of the resurrection, and it's implied that there are going to be these appearances, presumably for a non-Christian audience, let's say, the interest would be, oh, well, what would the resurrection appearances like? Let me go to the community. It's meant to kind of pull people in and not overwhelm them with too much information. So I see some plausibility with that particular argument that you raised there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I haven't actually seen that as a proposal for the short ending of Mark with respect to this particular issue.
Mhm.
But I think you're right that
Yeah, I'm gonna copyright it now.
write a paper and publish it.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, no, I think that is interesting, and I think that is very harmonious with the sort of charismatic understanding of Mark that I'm putting forward. The main point, though, is just whatever the explanation is for Mark's omission of the resurrection appearances, and I like the one that you're proposing. But whatever his reason might be, even if we can't give a plausible theory as to why, is because we know that Mark betrays his own knowledge of these appearances. For whatever reason he leaves them out, we can't say, oh, well, he left them out because he wasn't aware of them. So you can't say that this is somehow evidence that he doesn't know Matthew or Luke's gospel.
All right, here's one last question, which is, all right, we've seen that there are problems with the arguments for Markan priority. They could just as well fit with Matthean priority. What's the evidence now for Matthean priority?
Okay, so it comes from two different categories. So we have the external evidence, which we kind of touched on earlier, and we've got internal evidence. So, well, we can talk about the external evidence in a little more detail first. So, I mean, this primarily comes from our early witnesses to the writings of the Gospels. So this comes from people like Irenaeus, right? Papias is our earliest witness. Unfortunately, he doesn't really say anything about the order in which the Gospels were written, but Irenaeus does. Irenaeus is very clear that Matthew's the first Gospel to be written, and that John is the last one. He's a little more dubious. He lists Mark second and Luke third, but the interesting thing about Irenaeus is that he doesn't put any timestamps, as it were, on the composition of Mark or the composition of Luke. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there as to whether Mark or Luke comes before the other. He's very clear Matthew's written first and that Mark is written afterwards, but then he's just like, and Luke also got written and then last John. So there's room in Irenaeus for saying that maybe Luke comes before Mark. My roommate will argue with me and say that he thinks that's really he thinks that there's a very clear trajectory in Irenaeus where he's trying to say Mark is second. But the point is Irenaeus doesn't really seal the deal on that. He leaves it open. Clement is very clear. Matthew and Luke are the first two written, and that Mark is third. I think it's Tertullian. Some people will try to say that he says that Matthew and John are the first two Gospels to have been written. But I think if we interpret Tertullian carefully, he's just saying that Matthew and John implant faith in you first in the sense of being the most important because these are the eyewitnesses and that it's being confirmed by Mark and Luke. So I don't think Tertullian, when he says that Matthew and John implant the faith in us, is necessarily saying that these Gospels were written before the others. I think he's just saying that they're first in order of importance. Origen will be the real counterexample to my theory because Origen is pretty clear. I think that he thinks that the Gospel of Mark is written second and that Luke is written third. There is a little bit of wiggle room in Origen. William Farmer makes the case that he doesn't quite seal the deal. He does leave it a little ambiguous on the order of Luke and Mark. But I think it is probably safe to say that Origen is probably the first church father who definitely thinks it's Matthew, Mark, Luke. But again, Clement is earlier, and I'm going to say Clement is clear that it's Matthew, Luke, Mark. So I would go with Clement over.
And which Clement are you talking about? Alexandria?
Yeah. Clement of Alexandria.
All right.
Yeah, sorry, because there's also a Clement of Rome, but yes, right. Clement of Alexandria. And then I think the last one we're going to get is Augustine, who does say in his earlier writings he follows Origen and says Matthew, Mark, Luke. But David Peabody has a article out there where he argues that Origen changes his mind on it later on and comes to believe that it's Matthew, Luke, Mark. People can read Peabody's paper and come to the conclusion that they want it. But the point is we got broad agreement that Matthew is first across the board. Like there's no disagreement on that at all. They all agree John is last. potentially there's some disagreement on Mark and Luke, but I think there's another argument which really seals the deal that it has to be Mark that's third. And that's where I transition to the internal evidence. Before I move to that, though, did you have any comments on the patristics?
Yeah. So, as you noted, all of them seem to agree that Matthew's first. And I guess one question I have is, this attestation's good, but is it, so we have multiple attestation, but are they independent, or are they all kind of just piggybacking off of Irenaeus? Or it sounds like Augustine was working off of Origen. So to what extent are these also independent traditions?
Yeah, and that's a good question, and one that I don't think gets enough attention. I think we can establish the independence of Irenaeus and Papias, for example. Papias tells us that his source is John the Elder. We know that Irenaeus knows Papias's sources, excuse me, but Papias, but rather Irenaeus actually was more associated with Polycarp,
right,
and tells us that he gets his information from Polycarp, who in turn, according to Irenaeus, it was told to him by Polycarp that Polycarp got his information from the Apostle John as well. So I think we do have independence in Papias and Irenaeus, both going back to the Apostle John. It's harder to establish the independence of some of the sources later on.
Sure.
Plausibly, we could say that Clement is independent of Papias and Irenaeus, because he gives us additional details that we don't find in Papias or Irenaeus, specifically the idea that Matthew and Luke are the first two gospels to be written. Neither Papias nor Irenaeus directly says this. Irenaeus is a little ambiguous on whether Mark or Luke is second. Clement is not. So we do have some additional details there. So if we don't want to say that Clement is just making this stuff up whole cloth, then we're going to have to say he has another source of information. So I think that there is at least some reason to suspect that there's some independence here.
Okay, interesting. Now to the internal evidence.
All right. So yeah, one argument that I find interesting, it's developed by Thomas Longstaff at book length in this book, Evidence of Conflation in Mark, is, the evidence for the conflations in Mark. So kind of this comes out of, there's several places in Mark's gospel where Mark says things that are redundant. And this is well known about Mark's gospel, is that Mark is a very redundant writer. He'll say things almost in the same way, twice, many times. So just to give you an example of this. And I think, in Mark 1:32, right, Mark says, "Now when evening came, after the sun had set." It's like he's saying the same thing twice. And what's interesting is that when we read the parallels in Matthew and in Luke, we get the same, we get one half of each of those statements, right? In Matthew's gospel, we get the phrase "after the sun had set," or rather we get that in Luke. In Matthew, we get "now when the evening had come." In Luke, we get "when the sun had set." So it looks like what Mark is doing is bringing these together, and that's causing his account to have this kind of needless redundancy there, is that he's bringing it together. And it's not just that little example. As you continue through that account, he alternates between Matthew and Luke's language. And so if you're operating on the hypothesis that Matthew and Luke, whether you think they knew each other or not, are copying from Mark, you've got to give some kind of explanation for why are they pulling out opposite parts of Mark's narrative into their own, right? Whereas if we say that Luke, or rather we say that Mark is the one who's third, working from both Matthew and Luke, we got a really easy explanation for why that is, because he's the one merging these accounts together. And so that's why we get this alternation. The redundancy part is important because we know from documents that are known examples of conflations that redundancy is a hallmark of conflators. This comes out, for example, in the Diatessaron, right, which is a known conflation of the Gospels. You get a lot of redundancy in there. and there are other historical examples of this as well that Longstaff goes through in his book. But basically, we know when documents are conflating, you tend to get this redundancy. We got like 17 examples of this in the Gospel of Mark, where it looks like he's meshing together Matthew and Luke's narratives. So the alternatives are kind of either he's bringing them together, or somehow they just decided to independently take out completely opposite parts of Mark in these narratives. And it just seems like a really ad hoc explanation to say that. How did they know to leave out the parts that the other synoptic author had taken? So that's an argument that I find particularly persuasive in terms of internal evidence for not necessarily thinking that Matthew's first, but at any rate, certainly for thinking that Mark is third.
Yeah, because I think with this particular argument, the person who's going to defend Markan Priority, they're going to say, well, I mean, just like you said with our arguments, right, that you can accommodate them with Matthean Priority, we can accommodate these with Markan Priority, right? So, for example, maybe what we're going to say is that, Mark has these things that look like conflations and redundancies, and then Matthew, let's say, picks his favorite set, and then Luke maybe has access to Matthew and Mark. And then Luke, okay, doesn't want to do the redundancies or do what Matthew had done with Mark. And so Luke takes the other half that Matthew didn't take from Mark. And so that's one possibility, right? You could construct an alternate timeline in that way.
Well, it's not possible if you want to hold to the two-source hypothesis, because on the two-source hypothesis, Luke does not know Matthew,
right?
And Matthew does not know Luke. So
right.
You don't have that option open to you if you want to hold to the two-source hypothesis. You just have to say it's a happy coincidence or something like that. If you hold to the Farrer hypothesis, which does say that Luke knows Matthew's gospel, that option's open to you, but it's just a question of why. Right? Why does Luke choose to take the half that take the other half of Mark that Matthew left out, right? Like, there's not a clear motivation for him to do that. It's like we have to say that Luke is using both of these documents in front of him. It's like, I see what you did there, Matthew. You took this half, I'm taking the other half. High five, buddy. And like, there's not a clear reason for that. Whereas if we say that Mark is the third one written, we've got a very clear reason for the phenomenon in question, and it's that Mark is trying to bring these two narratives together. So there's an easy, sensible explanation when we say that Mark is the third one written. Whereas if we say that Luke is doing this in response to Matthew, we just kind of have this unanswered sort of why question.
All right.
That was all I had in terms of internal arguments. There are other ones, but those ones get a little more technical, and I can go through them if you want. But a lot of them build off of the conflation one, so I thought I'd leave it at one there.
Sure. Well, I do have some other questions to ask. So, Irenaeus talks about how Matthew is written in the Hebrew dialect. And I know that there's a lot of debate among New Testament scholars on if Matthew has the Greek Matthew that we have has any indication of, let's say, a Hebrew, let's say, predecessor. Do you have an opinion on that issue? What are your thoughts there? Because somebody might say, oh, well, you'll trust Irenaeus on when the gospel was written, but you won't trust Irenaeus when he says what language the gospel is written in or whatever. What are your thoughts on that issue?
So if I thought Irenaeus was really saying that Matthew was composed in Hebrew or Aramaic, I would believe him on that as well. Several questions, of course, arise if we posit that, like, to what extent is the relationship between that sort of Hebrew original and our canonical Gospel of Matthew? Is one a translation of the other? Maybe the canonical one's an expansion on that. Is Matthew still the author in that case? The arguments against the idea that our canonical Matthew could have been translated from a Hebrew original are, quite frankly, poor, and that's the most common argument against this hypothesis. I have not yet seen a good argument to the effect that canonical Matthew could not have been translated from that. And even then, we wouldn't have to say it was a strict translation, right? Like, let's say there was some kind of knockout argument that our Gospel of Matthew couldn't have been translated directly from a Hebrew original. we could say that this is like an expansion of it, that there was, some improvement that happened, and we would kind of expect that. So yeah, the arguments against it aren't that good. Oh, and another point on this too is that we have other known instances of this happening in the ancient world. This happened, for example, with First Maccabees, right? First Maccabees was first written in Hebrew, but that was just lost, and we don't have that today. We know that the earliest version of Josephus's The Wars of the Jews was composed in Hebrew, and then it got reproduced in Greek later on, and we don't possess any trace of that original text today. So it's not implausible that this is the sort of thing that could happen. With all that being said, so I do think the idea of a Hebrew Matthew is defensible. The question is, do we have to interpret Papias and Irenaeus as saying that it was originally composed in Hebrew? It's at least possible to read them in another way. So the term that they use there, dialecto, can also be translated as style or dialect. So it doesn't have to be interpreted as Hebrew language. And it's not controversial at all that Matthew's gospel is the most Jewish in terms of its flavor, right? He's got this goal to prove that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. So that's not implausible to me. It does depend on this being a secondary definition of the word, right? It does usually mean language, or I should say that's the primary definition. But I mean, it's not unheard of for this to mean style or dialect. So scholars like Robert Gundry have argued that the context of Papias here, it's better understood as interpreting it as a Hebrew style. The biggest difficulty with Gundry's argument is that Papias also goes on to say that everyone interpreted or translated this as best as they could, which seems to suggest some kind of language barrier, which may lend credence to that Papias is actually saying that this was composed in the Hebrew language. So it gets technical really fast. I say both ideas are defensible. So if we really are going to interpret Papias and Irenaeus as saying Hebrew language, and again, I don't think we have to. I think that we could interpret this legitimately as being a Hebrew style or a Hebrew dialect. But if they are saying that this is the Hebrew language, that's a defensible idea as well. So kind of my approach to that is to just kind of do both. I say both ideas are defensible, so let's defend them both.
Yeah, that's a very ecumenical response. When you mentioned First Maccabees, my heart kind of sung a little bit. So you know how to appeal to a Catholic audience. Regarding if Matthew was written in Hebrew, I know that, for example, Andreas Kostenberger, in his commentary on Matthew, he mentioned something like, well, there doesn't seem to be any evidence, or let's say there's no need to have that as a precursor to the Greek Matthew that we have. And then even there's a recent book that came out by G. Scott Gleaves, Did Jesus Speak Greek?, where he makes a similar argument that basically the Greek that Matthew is using seems really sophisticated, no need for, let's say, a prior or precursor Hebrew. And also it's written in such a way that there isn't the awkwardness that you would expect from a translation from one language to another language. So basically, Kostenberger saying, do we need to have a Hebrew precursor? And then Gleaves is saying we don't need one, So those are some thoughts there. I don't know if you have any opinions on that. I know that you basically were very ecumenical in saying both are defensible, so I'm not going to try to make you defend a side, but any thoughts?
No, but yeah. To the extent that I'm gonna say that it is defensible, then I should be willing to defend it.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I never seen the force in this. And this is because, so for example, this is the illustration that's coming to mind, right? So I mentioned this book by H.H. Stoll earlier, right? History and Criticism of the Markan Hypothesis. This is the book that kicked off the Griesbach Revolution in Germany. It is written in German. This is an English translation of it. A good English translation of it, right? I speak both German and English, and I'm not picking up in this book at all that, oh yeah, I can tell that's a carryover from German, right? Now I'm not looking for that either, to be fair, but just as I was reading it, it reads like a book that was written in English. So the translators of this book did a good job, as far as I can tell. And I'm no expert on how translation and such works. So I'm just saying it's not that, like, we shouldn't be too quick to assume that it would have to be awkward or clunky or something like that. It could have been smoothed over and stuff as it was being translated. And again, we don't have to say that this is an exact word for word translation, right? So Martin Moss will be a scholar who, for example, very strongly holds to a Hebrew Matthew. And he's not even a Matthean priorist, by the way. He says that our contemporary Gospel of Matthew was, an improvement upon this Hebrew original. So, we can say that there is an underlying Hebrew gospel that it's based off of, but that it doesn't have to be, just a direct word for word copy of that there could be additional material added in here, or that the information here was sort of expanded upon or even reworked in different words. So we consider that's like a source of it, but that it's not, a direct translation. That also seems to me to be a defensible idea on that front, though I'm a little reluctant to go that far myself, because I'm not really sure we have to. Like a stronger argument, I think, is one that you'd get from like J.R.C. Koosland, who argues that our Gospel of Matthew, right, that all of the scripture references in it, these all come from the Septuagint, right? They don't come from the Masoretic text like we might expect if it was originally written in Hebrew. But the issue I have with that argument, of course, is if somebody's translating this work into Greek, and they come across the Matthew scriptural citations, rather than translate all of those themselves out of the Masoretic text. That work's already been done with the Septuagint, so it just makes sense that they would instead copy those out of the Septuagint instead of doing original translation work with respect to Matthew's citations. That's at least an attempt at an argument, though, to say that Matthew couldn't have been translated from Greek. It's because, like, look at his scripture. In short, I just find the arguments very weak on that front to say that it couldn't have been a translation. But, and again, we have the other possibility that, the words of Irenaeus and Papias can be understood differently.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, so I'll lay out what I think so far. It seems like to me, I could see the argument going either way in terms of leaving out the patristics for a moment. Just either way, it seems like you could construct models that would work with either Markan priority or Matthean priority. I mean, there might be some room for saying that, somebody could say, okay, David, I concede, let's say, that Mark has a high Christology already to begin with, right? But they might say, but it gets higher and higher and higher until you get to John. So it's not that it goes from low to high; it just goes from high to higher, right? That might be one way to circumvent the Christology argument, if you will. But leaving that out for just a moment, I think for me, what it looks like is the patristics is the tiebreaker for this. It's just like, well, the earliest hypothesis that we have from living memory is that Matthew was first. So, and if we, let's say, have equal reason to accept either hypothesis, but then we have this one early mark in its favor, or early, let's say, point, I don't want to confuse my words, but an early point in favor of Matthew, then why not go with Matthew being the first written gospel? What are your thoughts there? I know I dropped a lot, but yeah.
No, that's fine. For me, that definitely is the tiebreaker myself. I put a lot of weight on the patristics, and really, while I do think that the argument from conflation is a good one, the reason I use that one is more so because of how highly internal evidence is prized over external evidence in kind of just modern synoptic studies. Again, just the attitude towards the patristics is they're just so easily dismissed by scholars. Like like you might get like a page or two of discussion in books on it, but oftentimes they don't even get that. And these are our earliest historical sources. I think it was Martin Moss who said in his book on this that he doubts that the most prudent thing to do in a historical investigation is to disregard all of your earliest historical sources on the matter.
All
And so
right.
that really is the approach I advocate for, is let's take that more seriously. Because like, look, internal evidence, I'm all for it if internal evidence really forces us to Markan priority. But the tendency of internal evidence is it really just tends to demonstrate that there's some sort of literary relationship here, and it doesn't give you any directional indicator. It doesn't tell you which direction the dependency goes. So internal evidence tends to be inconclusive, and it's considered perfectly acceptable historical practice. I mean, to look at historical witnesses if you've got good reasons to think they're reliable. So I don't think there's anything illegitimate about sort of giving, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't even say primacy, but of at least giving the patristics a hearing. Like let's hear what they have to say, and if we don't have like overwhelmingly decisive reasons to reject them, I don't think that we do, then like let's at least take that seriously.
Yeah, I mean, even in New Testament scholarship today, there are people like Marcus Bachmuel who are trying to make a move towards honoring or recognizing, I should say, just if you have testimony within living memory, Craig Keener has also done work on this in Christo biography. If you have sources within living memory, go like run with them, don't dismiss them. You really don't want to dismiss that period in which, people like Irenaeus or even Papias with the, if I'm not mistaken, Papias had a direct connection to Mark, and then through that to Peter. Or am I getting that mixed up there?
It was, his connection was to Polycarp, who had it to
Okay,
John.
there we go. So I might be mixing up some things there, but I know that Irenaeus was connected to Polycarp to John. So you still have sources within living memory. I mean, you don't want to dismiss that. So those are some of my thoughts on that issue. David, do you have anything else that you want to say?
I might close with a quote. I found the actual quotation from Martin Moss here, so I might just close with that, if that's all right. So he said, quote, "There appears to be a consensus that if conclusions reached from source criticism conflict with the witness of the early church, then the latter can be dismissed with the lamest of explanations, or sometimes without any explanation at all. Papias thus becomes the primary whipping boy when the early fathers' belief that Matthew wrote first is thought to conflict with the generally accepted priority of Mark. Goodacre, evidently embarrassed by this conflict, is more horrifyingly forthright than most, saying, 'It will be most prudent to continue to treat the patristic witness with a pinch of salt.' I doubt, however, whether the optimal approach to any historical problem is to jettison all the available ancient evidence at the outset. Discrediting the early fathers simply raises the unanswered, and indeed usually unasked question, how did they all come to be so wrong?" End quote.
Man, that's just a mic drop right there.
I like the quote so much. I've got some videos coming up on the topic, and I was like, I got to include this quote in there.
Well, David, it was great having you on the show again.
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity.
Yep, and for everyone who has watched, thank you for enjoying this episode with me and David. Once again, I'm going to link David, your channel in the description. Remind me again the name of your channel.
Well, I got two, but
Okay.
Faith Because of Reason is the main one, where I'll be releasing a few videos on the synoptic problem and trying to popularize the case for Matthean priority.
And what's the other channel?
It's called Christian Evidentialism.
Right.
I haven't done much with it in a while, though.
Okay. Well, David, it was great having you on. And for all the people who are watching, if you love the work that Intellectual Catholicism is doing, also, be sure to like and subscribe and support me on Patreon if you are willing to. I'd greatly appreciate it. But with that, thank you for watching.